In the early 1930s, nationalist factions within the Japanese military and political establishment began to seize the reins of power. Feeling snubbed by the West, particularly with regards to the Washington Naval Treaty, which allowed Japan a navy only two-thirds the size of the United States and Great Britain, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and the Washington Treaty. Freed from treaty obligations, Japan was free to construct ships as large and as heavy as they pleased. Japan realised that they didn't have the economic or industrial capacity to maintain a navy larger than the US or UK, so instead chose quality over quantity. They planned an enormous battleship that would not only intimidate other nations, but be able to outmatch any other battleship design in the world. Japan had been planning a capital ship with 18-inch guns for some time. After the completion of Nagato in 1920, several classes of battleship were drawn up to fill the remaining quota in the 8-8 fleet program. The final class planned was the so-called No. 13. The Washington Treaty put an end to the No. 13 class, as well as all other battleship classes in the planning stage. Japan attempted to design capital ships that adhered to the treaty, but it wasn't until they withdrew from it that the beginnings of the Yamato emerged. Many different designs were produced, but slowly these were whittled down. One of the contending designs featured all three turrets in front of the superstructure. In World of Warships, the Tier 9 battleship Yuzuru is an approximation of how the Yamato may have looked if this design was chosen. However, naval designers went for the more orthodox arrangement of two turrets fore and one aft. The design had been finalised by March 1937, and Yamato was laid down in November the same year. On the 8th of August 1940, Yamato was launched at Kure Naval Shipyard. She was, and would remain, the heaviest battleship ever built, and her guns were the largest ever fitted to a warship. Her sister, Musashi, followed 3 months later. The third ship, Shinano, was converted into an aircraft carrier during construction and launched in October 1944. 2 more ships were planned, but were never built. Yamato's primary armament was the 18.1-inch or 460mm 45 caliber Type 94 naval gun, 9 guns in 3 triple turrets. The Type 94's armour-piercing shell weighed 3,219 pounds and left the barrel at a speed of 790 meters per second, with a maximum range of 45,790 yards. At a range of 30 kilometers, it could penetrate 360mm of flat armour. Initial secondary armament was 12 155mm guns in 4 triple turrets. These were taken from the Mogami-class cruisers when they were upgunned with 8-inch cannons. The 105mm guns midships were later removed to make more room for dual-purpose and anti-air guns. 3 twin 127mm gun mounts were mounted on each side of the ship. This was later increased to 6 a side. Anti-air armament consisted of 4 13.2mm machine guns and 24 25mm autocannons, though many more would be added in the future. Yamato's armour protection was unsurpassed by any battleship. Her main belt was 410mm thick and the turret faces were 650mm. Taking their angling into account, this made them invulnerable to 16-inch shellfire at virtually any range. Advanced alloys were used in the deck armour, which reached 200mm over vital areas. There was a weak point in the ship's side armour, however. The upper and lower portions of the belt were precariously joined together, and a split could form if this area was put under a lot of stress, as it would be when the ships came under heavy torpedo attack. Propulsion came from 12 Canpon boilers supplying power to 4 steam turbines, which in turn drove 4 propellers. Total horsepower was just under 150,000, allowing the enormous Yamato class to reach a top speed of 27 knots. The heavy fuel consumption of the class limited their use, however, as oil was not a commodity Japan had in large supply. Yamato's first major undertaking was as Yamamoto's flagship during the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. The Admiral directed the battle from her bridge. The combined fleet's battleships were not a priority for the American strike craft, which attacked the Japanese carriers instead. On the 28th of August, US submarine Flying Fish engaged Yamato, firing 4 torpedoes, but none scored a hit. Yamato docked at Kure, and remained there for the rest of the year. Fuel was in short supply, as was ammunition for her 18-inch guns. In early 1943, Musashi replaced Yamato as flagship of the combined fleet. On the 18th of April 1943, Admiral Yamamoto was killed when his aircraft was shot down. His ashes were carried aboard Musashi back to Japan the following month. Both ships patrolled throughout 1943 without seeing action. Because of their large size and extensive protection, they were used as transport ships on several occasions, ferrying troops and supplies to island bases across the Pacific. It was while on one of these trips Yamato was attacked by a US submarine for the second time. On the 25th of December 1943, on a voyage from Yokosuka to Truk, she was attacked by USS Skate. One of Skate's 21-inch torpedoes struck Yamato. This attack exposed the weakness in Yamato's belt, the joint between the upper belt armour and the torpedo bulkhead. This joint failed, allowing water into the ship's hull, and one of the rear turret's magazines flooded. Yamato took on around 3,000 tons of water before the flooding was brought under control. She arrived safely at Truk the same day. Musashi's career was a quiet one until March 1944. When she was returning to Japan after delivering cargo to Palau, the submarine USS Tunny fired 6 torpedoes at her. 5 missed, but one struck towards the ship's bow, flooding the ship with around 3,000 tons of seawater and killing 7 sailors. In early 1944, both ships docked in Kure for extensive redesigns to their armament. The 155mm turrets amidships were removed, and each was replaced with 3 twin 127mm turrets, joining the 3 that were already mounted on each side. 94 25mm anti-air guns were also added in double and triple mounts, and improved radar systems were installed. In May 1944, both ships were assigned to the 1st Mobile Fleet, and would sail together until Musashi's demise. The 2 battleships escorted aircraft carriers in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, but did not contribute to the battle. It was fought between the carriers of each navy. In October the same year, the Americans launched an invasion of the Philippine Islands. A large force of Japanese ships formed a response to the invasion as Operation Shogo, including the 1st Mobile Fleet. On the 24th of October, on their way to Leyte, the formation of ships was attacked by 2 US submarines, Data and Dace. Waiting in ambush, the 2 subs fired 10 torpedoes in total, scoring multiple hits on the heavy cruisers Atago and Maya, both of which quickly sank. Admiral Kurita was on board Atago, and was rescued from the water by a destroyer before transferring to Yamato. The next day, Kurita's force was sailing through the Sibian Sea when it was spotted by US reconnaissance planes. Throughout the day, aircraft from the carriers Intrepid, Lexington, Enterprise, Essex, Franklin and Cabot attacked the Japanese fleet. Musashi in particular was targeted by the attacking aircraft. At 10:29 am, Musashi receives her first hit. A torpedo strikes her starboard side, the impact jamming the main fire control director. At 12:03 pm, the second attack begins. 2 bombs strike Musashi and 5 narrowly miss her. One of the bombs damages an engine and boiler room, reducing her speed to 22 knots. 3 minutes later, Avengers launch another torpedo attack. Musashi is hit 3 times on the port side. Some of her engine and machinery spaces are flooded. Counter-flooding nearly eliminates the list, but Musashi's bow is down in the water by around 6 feet. Musashi engages enemy aircraft with her 18-inch guns, firing Sanshikidan anti-air shells which burst into thousands of metal fragments. A bomb fragment enters the muzzle of one of the guns on the forward turret, detonating a shell in the breech and jamming the turret's vertical elevation. At 1:31 pm, the third attack wave arrives. Several near misses from bombs and strafing runs from F-6F Hellcats cause casualties amongst the anti-air crews exposed on deck. A fresh wave of TBM Avengers arrives and achieves 4 more torpedo hits. Fuel tanks are ruptured, and a room being used to tend to casualties is permeated with poisonous carbon monoxide. SB-2C Helldivers score 4 hits with bombs. 20 minutes after it begins, the third attack ceases. Musashi's bow is now 13 feet lower than it should be, and virtually all of her counter-flooding compartments have been used. 20 minutes after, the fourth attack wave begins, but it does not target Musashi. It is Yamato's turn, and she sustains several bomb hits. At 2:55 pm, the fifth air attack commences. By now, Musashi is trailing behind the fleet and can only make 8 knots. Helldivers make an attack run, scoring 4 1,000-pound bomb hits, causing heavy casualties, particularly to damage control parties trying to keep the ship afloat. Yet another wave of Avengers strike from both sides, scoring 3 more torpedo impacts. By now, Musashi is down to 12 knots. Almost immediately after the fifth wave, the sixth wave begins their attack. Multiple bombs explode on our decks at 3:25, and the Admiral's bridge is destroyed by a bomb, killing most of the ship's command staff. Musashi's commander, Admiral Inoguchi, survives and moves to the ship's secondary bridge. 3 bombs strike near the bow and the forecastle, destroying the ship's primary communications room and damaging 2 boiler rooms. 2 more explode further back, destroying 3 anti-air mounts. Another lands right in amongst the anti-air suite, killing and wounding many sailors. Another casualty clearing station is destroyed by the next bomb, which in turn is followed by 2 more bombs. A further wave of Avengers inflict 5 torpedo hits, 3 port and 2 starboard, causing huge flooding. At the same time, another bomb explodes and damages yet another boiler room. The air assault has finally ended. Musashi has been hit by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, with a further 18 bombs narrowly missing her. Admiral Kurata's fleet links back up with Musashi to find her listing 10 degrees to port, with her bow nearly 30 feet down in the water. Desperate measures to control the list are used, including gathering the crew and supplies on the starboard side of the ship, and flooding more rooms, including crew sleeping spaces and engine rooms. By 7:30 p.m, Musashi is beginning to roll over, her list now at 30 degrees. The order to abandon ship is given, and 5 minutes later, the battleship capsizes, Admiral Irotoko going down with the ship. Shortly after sinking, 2 explosions are heard from under the waves, then silence. 1,376 survivors are rescued, and 1,203 sailors die. The rest of Kurata's force continues on toward Leyte. The next day, Kurata's Center Force fleet passes through the San Bernardino Strait to engage US ships supporting troops on Leyte. Most of the American fleet had sailed north before Kurata arrived, leaving a relatively small force, named Taffy 3, off the island of Samar. In the ensuing engagement, Yamato fires her main guns against enemy surface ships for the first and only time in her career, scoring hits on several US ships, including the carriers Gambier Bay and White Plains. Yamato disengages after manoeuvring to avoid torpedoes, having suffered only light damage from bombs that narrowly missed her and several strafing runs. Kurata's center force withdrew later the same day, retiring to Brunei. On the 21st of November, Yamato and the fleet she was leading withdrew from Brunei and set sail for Kure. It was during this voyage that the submarine USS Sea Lion attacked and sank the battleship Congo. In early 1945, Yamato was assigned to the 1st Carrier Division as an escort ship. On the 19th of March, an aerial raid targeted the ships based at Kure Naval Base, including Yamato, who suffered minor damage from several near misses and 1 direct bomb hit on her bridge. By April, it was clear that the noose was tightening around Japan. US troops had invaded the island of Okinawa, only around 700 kilometers from the southern tip of Japan. As a response, the Imperial Japanese Navy planned a mission with Yamato as the centerpiece to take the fight to Okinawa and beach the great battleship on the island's shores, acting as a stationary gun battery to fend off US attacks. Filling her magazines with as much ammunition as they could take, Yamato and her fleet named the Surface Special Attack Force, consisting of Yamato, 1 cruiser and 8 destroyers, departs Tokuyama port on the afternoon of the 6th of April, marking the beginning of Operation Tengo. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the Americans were listening and decoding their radio traffic, and knew all the details of the operation. Not far from the Japanese mainland, US submarines made visual contact with the attack force, but the Japanese ships were travelling too fast and zigzagging as a precaution against torpedo attack. American naval forces around Okinawa began to prepare for the arrival of the Japanese, a large force of battleships, cruisers and destroyers sailing north to meet them before they were in range of the island. But the main striking force would come from the carrier-launched aircraft of Admiral Mark Mitcher's task force. On the morning of the 7th of April, a flying boat shadowed the Japanese for several hours, tracking their movements. Yamato engaged with 18-inch anti-air shells, but could not discourage the recon planes, who continued to track the ships until the first attack aircraft arrived at roughly 12:30 p.m, 50 dive bombers and 98 torpedo bombers, as well as a large fighter escort. The first victim is the destroyer Asashimo. After developing engine trouble, she lags behind the main force and is set upon by aircraft, sinking quickly with the loss of all of her 326 crewmen. 2 bombs strike Yamato, one of which knocks out the rear 155mm turrets. Yamato begins to execute a high-speed turn to starboard when a pair of 1,000-pound bombs hit her, one exploding inside of one of the ship's crew spaces and the other striking near the rear 105mm turret, igniting its magazine and engulfing it in a fire that remains burning until the ship's demise. At 12:43, the first Avenger torpedo attack begins, and a single hit is scored on the port side. Yamato counterfloods as F-4U Corsairs attack with machine guns and rockets. 1 Corsair strikes a hit with a 1,000-pound bomb, and several Helldivers claim further bomb hits shortly after. At 1:33 p.m, the second wave begins their attack, focusing on Yamato. A large number of Avengers make an attack run at once, and Yamato takes 3 torpedo hits to the port side, jamming one of her rudders. Damage control teams apply counterflooding and the listing is brought under control. Immediately after, another flight of Avengers makes their run, and 2 more torpedoes hit the port side. Multiple bombs also strike her at around the same time. 20 minutes later, more planes make their attacks, 3 bombs and 3 torpedoes, 1 starboard and 2 port. Yamato is now listing heavily and struggling to make 12 knots. The flooding is too severe and cannot be corrected. The order to abandon ship is given shortly after 2 p.m. By now, the escorting cruiser Yahagi has succumbed to the dozen bombs and 7 torpedoes that have struck her, going down with 445 of her crew. Minutes later, Yamato is slowly starting to roll over. A final squadron of Avengers make a torpedo run, their torpedoes striking deep down on the lower starboard side that is being exposed as the ship rolls to port. Yamato finally capsizes, but just before sinking, an enormous explosion from one of the main magazines delivers the coup de grace, sending up a plume of smoke that can be seen 100 miles away on the island of Kyushu. 276 sailors are saved, and 3,055 perish. With the loss of Yamato, the already crippled back of the Imperial Japanese Navy is broken, along with any final hopes of a decisive naval battle. The largest remaining symbol of Japan's might as a naval power is destroyed, and for the rest of the war, the Navy's few remaining capital ships remain moored in port, relegated to reserve or acting as anti-aircraft batteries. The Yamato-class ships will always remain as the defining example of the battleship. Powerful, imposing, the ultimate projection of naval power in the early 20th century. But the era of the battleship comprehensively passed with the end of World War II. The fate of both Musashi and Yamato was and is a lasting example of the dominance of air power in naval warfare.